Thanks very much for inviting me to offer comments to this important conference on carbon farming. My name is Ben Lilliston. I'm the Director of Climate Strategies at the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy. We're based in Minnesota. We have offices in Washington and Berlin. IATP was formed during the farm crisis of the 1980s to really work with family farmers to figure out what international as well as national policies are impacting farmers on the ground. And we've worked pretty intensely over the last 15 years at this intersection of climate change and agriculture. I'm going to talk briefly about the US experience with agriculture carbon offset markets, and more specifically, why farmers are very skeptical of those markets. While farmers are always interested in new ways to add income, the question is always at what cost? There are a growing number of farmers in the US very interested in soil health for a whole number of reasons: to increase biodiversity, to lower chemical use, to build climate resilience. And most of those, the vast majority, are not participating in carbon offset markets. So based on conversations with farmers and farm groups over the last several years, I'm going to summarize 8 reasons why the participation rate in voluntary carbon offset markets has been so low in the United States. Number one, probably not surprising, the prices paid to farmers are very low, too low, lower than the costs that are involved for them to participate in those markets and qualify for carbon credits. Carbon credit prices can range from around $1 to up to $15 to $20 a credit. And then there are also companies like Bayer and Cargill that do carbon credit programs that are less transparent, but that's our estimate about where the pricing is right now. The costs can be considerable. I mean, for a farmer, they have to think about planning, they have to think about measuring, reporting, verifying. They may need a third party to come in and verify what's going on. They have to negotiate prices, handle contracts, deal with risk involved, and potentially insure that. So just as an example, nori is a fairly big carbon market in the voluntary carbon market world here. It can cost up to $3,000 a project for farmers just to get it verified in order to qualify for nori. So that gives you some idea about how a smaller scale farmer, can be a prohibitive cost, whereas if you're a larger scale farmer, you may be able to enter into this. Reason number 2, there are no real rules right now for voluntary carbon offset credits in the United States. It's been called a Wild West. So you have all these different private companies as well as carbon market developers creating credits with their own rules, their own obligations for farmers, different costs, different prices. So it's very difficult to navigate. It'd be more accurate to describe this as a series of projects rather than an actual market where pricing and everything is a little bit more transparent. This makes farmers very concerned about the level of corporate control in the market. They're very much price takers in this market. They don't set the price. And so this is a problem that farmers experience in the agriculture economy broadly, right? There's a lot of corporate control. They don't have much to say about their input costs or how much they sell what they produce. And so this feels like just another market where they are a very small and weak player. And that creates a lot of distrust. Number 3, the voluntary offset credits really tend to benefit larger scale farms over smaller scale farms. And as I mentioned before, when the prices are really low, but some of the costs to get in are very high, it can close out smaller scale farmers. Larger scale farmers can sort of spread out those costs over more acres, which makes it a little bit easier for them to enter. In addition, carbon accreditors are more interested in larger farms. It's easier for them to set up a project on a 1,000-acre farm versus 10 100-acre farms. So the concern there among many farm groups is this is just another advantage for large scale farms. And will this continue to drive what we've already seen is greater consolidation in land ownership and farmland ownership in the US? We already have a lot of outside investors from Wall Street, even foreign investors buying up farmland. This is the #1 issue for small and beginning farmers is access to farmland and how challenging that is. So this carbon credit system really threatens to make that situation even worse. I think a more complex question is, how do these carbon credit system work with those who are renting land? And what power do they have in that? It seems like very little. And they may not even get the benefits of a carbon credit. They may go to the owner. So that's a very murky area that is also something that small scale farmers raise concerns about. Many of them are renting land. #4, a carbon offset credit can only be credible if it is additional carbon that has been sequestered. It has to be additional or something new. It can't be something that's happened in the past. And so you can see why many farmers here who've been practicing agroecology for years or even decades do not get credit for that carbon stored in the past. And now there's a question of, is there a capacity level in terms of how much soil, how much carbon you can actually sequester? And many of them may be reaching that capacity just because they've been doing good practices, like I said, for quite a while. And in some ways that puts them at a disadvantage to farmers who have been depleting their soil, maybe using very chemically intensive systems. They have more potential to sequester more carbon because their soil has so very little. So this issue of additionality is a big deal in the United States and voluntary carbon markets, and also the regulatory carbon markets. There's a study in California that found 82% of forestry carbon credits were not additional. So meaning they really got very little climate, next to no climate benefit from those carbon credits. Carbon Plan, a very respected organization here in the US, did an assessment of 14 different soil carbon credit protocols and found not a single one had a good screen for additionality. So this is a big issue here, because from a climate perspective, it needs to be additional, and that sort of has the potential to really punish farmers who've been farming, agroecologically for quite a while. #5, to qualify for carbon credits, farmers are required to share an enormous amount of data about what's happening on their farm, information about planting, seeds, fertilizer, equipment, when they harvest. And they're nervous about sharing that data with often very large companies. What are those companies doing with that data? Some of the companies, like say a Bayer or Cargill, are companies that they're dealing with, buying inputs for or selling to. So they feel like there's potential conflicts there. This is definitely a big issue among US farmers, is who controls the data and what is it being used for outside of just carbon credits. #6, carbon credits, contracts for carbon credits, raise new legal risks for farmers. So these contracts basically say what farmers can do on their farm, what can be done on their land, with an exclusive focus on sequestering carbon. They may restrict how much money a farmer can receive from government programs. From a climate perspective, these types of soil sequestration really needs to be permanent, right? You need to be able to take the carbon out of the air into the soil, and we know carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for up to 1,000 years. So it needs to be in there, and there can be situations where, whether it's a climate-related event, a drought, a flood, that really affects a farm, an individual farm, they need to be able to respond to that. At the same time, they're locked into a carbon credit contract which actually restricts what they can do on their farm to respond to changing conditions. I'd also point out, with a lot of farmers, there are economic challenges every year to try to keep farming. So farmers may have to either sell their farm or sell part of their farm to keep going. These type of contracts really restrict that or create complications for that. Who owns the credits when a farm is sold and so forth. A colleague of ours at Canada's Farmers Union put it this way: carbon contracts between 15 and 100 years are both too long and too short for the climate and too long for farmers. Number 7, while farmers know the value of improving soil health, as I mentioned before, a lot of interest and energy there. There is an emerging body of research really showing how uncertain our measurement of soil carbon is, both in the short term and the long term. Research is raising questions about whether carbon can be stored at the upper levels of soil for any significant length of time. A lot of soil carbon testing appears to overestimate the amount of carbon in the soil because they're sampling too close to the surface and not going deeper. We don't know much about how carbon moves between different levels of the soil. And then there's research about how climate change itself is impacting our ability to sequester carbon and may actually slow our ability to do so. These are things that farmers recognize. They understand they're operating and managing a real ecosystem on a farm. And so these scientific questions further shake the credibility of carbon credits, I think, in a farmer's mind and in the mind of the market. Number 8, there are growing doubts that offset credit markets can actually help us address the climate crisis here in the US. We do have experience with carbon markets in California and in Northeast states. Those carbon markets have not really responded to the climate crisis in terms of reducing emissions in the way that they had planned on and predicted. And so a lot of people see that poor performance. Some of the biggest critics of carbon markets in the US have been the environmental justice community. And their main complaint is that one of their main criticisms is that carbon offset credits actually allow polluters to keep polluting. So it gives them permission to buy their way out of reducing their actual emissions. And I think there's just a growing consensus that we need to focus on emission reduction, not buying our way out of reducing emissions. And I think also the agriculture community, while it recognizes the need to respond to the climate crisis, there's a lot of focus on resilience right now. I mean, we've experienced a major drought in the US, massive wildfires out in the western part of the country. The eastern part of the country and south has faced hurricanes and other real downpours. So the focus there is a lot more on resilience rather than thinking about how we might sequester some carbon and create really low price credits. Finally, I think some of the comments internationally and developments internationally are also shaping some of the thinking here about voluntary carbon markets. You may have seen the UN Secretary General has made some really strong comments recently, critical of companies relying on offsets at this stage rather than emissions reduction. The high-level panel on net zero commitments at COP27 made it really clear companies need to focus on emission reductions rather than offsets. And then the IPCC report last year also was very clear that there's not a one-to-one relationship between industrial sources of emissions and land-based carbon sequestration, that we need to separate these two things, and that climate change itself is going to slow our ability to sequester carbon. So in the US, in looking at alternatives to the offset credit-based response to the climate crisis, a lot of farm groups, environmental groups, and climate-focused groups are looking at more of a comprehensive approach. So there's great demand for conservation programs here in the US among farmers, unmet demand. So we have a farm bill right now that's being debated that will set farm policy in the US for the next 5 years. How can we expand investments in conservation programs to really meet the demand of farmers? And that'll bring a lot of climate benefits where it helps farmers build soil health, diversify their operation, grow different types of crops, put in perennial grasses, potentially integrate livestock, whatever works for them. But all those types of conservation practices will have climate benefits. And then there's a lot of interest among farmers in renewable energy, real renewable energy. So we would count that as mostly solar and wind. It makes sense for a lot of farmers on their farm to be able to generate their own energy and potentially sell it back to the grid. So there's a tremendous amount of interest in that. And there's a lot of public money coming towards that with the Inflation Reduction Act, which was passed last year. So farmers are interested in getting access to that, and that could be also part of the next farm bill. There's also a lot of interest in building out more community-based food systems. COVID and the disruptions associated with that really exposed some of the vulnerabilities in these longer supply chains. And I think people are recognizing that those vulnerabilities are also there with climate disruption. And so there's a lot of interest in how do we build out the infrastructure to really rebuild in a new way community-based food systems that obviously will lower transportation-related greenhouse gas emissions, but hopefully we can also support a more sustainable agroecological system as we start to rebuild those systems. So a lot of interest in energy and money and resources coming around that. And then how can we stop subsidizing the sources of agriculture that we know are major sources of emissions? The EPA greenhouse gas data tells us large-scale dairy, large-scale hog operations, and feedlots, beef feedlots to some extent, are the biggest sources of greenhouse gases, both from the animals, the ruminants, as well as their giant manure lagoons. And so how can we stop sending farm bill money and designing farm bill programs to incentivize more what we would call factory farms? And then the last thing is, I think people are grappling with how do we regulate this industry, particularly the largest dairies and hog operations that are producing the most greenhouse gas emissions. The EPA has moved to act on oil and gas. There's growing pressure on them to also act in the agriculture sector as well. So it's more of a comprehensive approach, but it is all the things I mentioned are programs that farmers are already familiar with to some extent. It's about making them work better and making them more accessible to more farmers and more rural communities who are building out, hopefully, what will be more a climate resilient system. I hope these comments are helpful for your discussion today. I wish I could be there in person, but hopefully my colleagues in Berlin can respond to any questions. An article I wrote summarizing a lot of these points, and that includes citations, hopefully can be shared with you. If you have any questions for me, please feel free to reach out. Thanks very much again for the opportunity to speak with you today.